Welcome to another quiet night with whispers of insomnia. Tonight we open the fragile pages of a life once lived in boots and wool under skies heavy with smoke and silence. You are invited to step into the final days of Lieutenant Adrian Heller, not through a textbook or a monument, but through the delicate ink of his private letters. What follows is not history as taught. It is memory, mood, and the soft imprint of a soul retreating from the noise of war. Each letter offers a glimpse, not into battles or victories, but into the moments between them, the taste of cold bread, the weight of quiet leadership, the comfort of a distant memory. So lay back. Let the cadence of his pen draw you closer, not to action, but to stillness, to the inner world of a man walking ever forward, even as the war folds inward behind him. January 3rd, 1944, dear Emil. It is snowing again. It always is, I think. But this morning, it was the soft kind, the kind that drifts instead of falling, like it's afraid to wake the dead branches. I stepped outside before the others, just for a moment. The snow made everything quieter. Even the wind seemed uncertain, like it didn't want to interrupt. The snow was always the first thing Adrian Heller mentioned. In nearly every letter that survived, snow played a role, as setting, as symbol, as silence. It was everywhere, packed into his boots, folded into his sleeves, curled beneath the collar of his coat like a cold whisper. Lieutenant Heller wrote the way some men prayed, not expecting a reply, but needing to speak all the same. The men stir in their sleep, not from dreams, I think, but from cold. We sleep on wet straw, if we're lucky. Some stretch coats over their heads. Others curl up with their rifles like old friends. I sleep with my hands tucked beneath my knees. It helps, a little. Their march had begun somewhere unnamed, a place with no signpost, no boundary marker, just the slow disappearance of one horizon behind them, and the uncertainty of another ahead. Each day was measured not in progress, but in survival. The road was packed earth, frozen hard. Their boots left faint prints that were quickly swallowed by wind and flurries. On the edges of the march, brittle trees watched in silence, bare, black spindles against the gray wash of the sky. There's a rhythm to it now. Walk, pause, adjust strap, walk again. One of the boys hums as he walks, a tune I don't know. But it helps. I've started counting steps between telegraph poles. I think the number's always the same, but I count anyway. It keeps the thoughts from unraveling. Adrian had once been a Latin instructor, before the war, before the uniform and the salutes and the weight of command. He had stood in chalk-dusted rooms, with rain tapping at the windows, discussing declensions and Roman virtue with students half awake and half aware. Now, in the quiet of winter's grip, he found those memories oddly sharp, clearer than the orders he'd received the night before. I thought of my old classroom today, Emil, the creaky floorboard near the window, the smell of damp coats hanging by the door. I would give anything for one more morning with that old kettle heating on the stove. Even the red ink stains on my fingers. The daily routine of a soldier on the march is full of motion, but it is not eventful. Much of it is sameness, discomfort, waiting. And yet, in Adrian's letters, these moments breathe with remarkable clarity. The bread today was hard. I had to soak it in melted snow before chewing. I tried not to watch the others while we ate. There's something private about hunger out here, not the kind that starves, but the kind that lingers, always asking for just a little more. Their unit had lost 2 men the week before. Not in battle, frostbite, and fever. One was buried shallowly beneath pine needles. The other they carried until the trucks could take him back. Adrian had not written about it directly, but his entries grew slower afterward, his words more careful, more internal. I find that I speak less now. There's nothing to say. The men look at me for answers I don't have, so I offer silence instead. It's better that way. Orders come and we obey, not because they make sense, but because it's all that keeps us from unraveling. There was one young soldier, Anton, the boy with the pebble. He'd grown up in a fishing village somewhere along the coast. He said the pebble was from the shore outside his house, perfectly smooth, worn by waves and time. He kept it in his glove and rubbed it constantly, like a rosary. Anton showed me his pebble again today. He said he dreamed of the sea last night. That's what hope becomes out here, Emil. Not a dream of survival, but of memory. We do not hope for victory. We hope to remember warmth, the smell of brine, the voice of a mother humming near a stove. At night, they sheltered wherever they could. Broken barns, ruined sheds, dugouts with more ice than floor. Fires were rare. Smoke drew attention. Adrian would often crouch near a wall, his back to the wind, scribbling beneath the light of a stolen candle stub. The sound of pens on paper is a kind of defiance, a way to say, I was here, I felt this, I lived. Tonight the wind moves through the cracks like a restless ghost. It moans against the boards, but I no longer flinch. I think it's just trying to remember what it used to be, a lullaby, maybe, or laughter through trees. In these quiet entries you sense the soldier becoming more than a uniform. You feel the drift, from duty to introspection. The cold softens ambition. Hunger dulls hierarchy. Men who once spoke of medals now speak only of mornings. Orion is back tonight. The clouds parted just enough. I watched the stars while chewing on a crust of stale biscuit. For a moment I forgot where I was. Not in escape, but in suspension, as if the stars remembered me and I remembered them. One of the younger men asked me if I thought we'd see spring again. I didn't know how to answer, so I said, perhaps. That's what hope sounds like now, perhaps. The segment ends not with drama, but with the same softness with which it began, a slow, rhythmic exhale into the dark. I will sleep now, Emil, or try. My fingers ache and my feet are swollen, but my heart is still quiet. And that, for tonight, will be enough. Yours always, Adrian. Let's pause with Adrian now, not to rush forward, but to let his words settle. His letters do not describe great battles. They don't mention tanks or heroics or sweeping movements on maps. Instead, they linger on the smallest things, the taste of hardened bread, the shape of a pebble, the way snow falls in silence. This is where history often hides, not in the proclamations of generals, but in the aching hands of a tired man counting telegraph poles to pass the time. Notice how Adrian described the world around him. He didn't see just snow. He noticed the kind of snow, soft, quiet, hesitant. And in that softness we find a kind of mirror, the inner landscape of a man whose certainty had begun to melt away, just as the roads had beneath their boots. Even his memories were tactile. The creaky floorboard in the classroom, the damp coats, the hiss of a kettle. You can feel him reaching backward toward a time when life was not measured by marsh or rations, but by the morning routines of a peaceful mind. There's something profoundly human in the way he compares suffering to silence. Hunger is not a loud, dramatic force in his writing. It is private. Lingering, it doesn't scream, it waits. And in the cold, in the damp dugouts and makeshift shelters, even time seems to wait with it. We hear of Anton, the boy with the pebble, a symbol so small, yet powerful. A memory you can carry in your glove, smooth, warm if held long enough. The kind of thing a child might pick up without knowing why, and a soldier might clutch as the last tether to home. Adrian doesn't speak of glory. He doesn't complain either. Instead, he observes, records. It's as if he's writing not just for Emil, but for time itself. A quiet plea. Remember us, not just for what we did, but for how we endured. And perhaps that's the central heartbeat of this journal. Not the thunder of war, but the quiet footfall of men walking towards something unknown and recording what they could along the way. As we reflect on this first entry, imagine yourself in Adrian's place, your hands stiff with cold, your breath visible with every word. You're exhausted, but you write. Because writing means you're still you, still human, still thinking of home. You don't dream of medals. You dream of floorboards and old red ink, of warmth, and of stars above the march. Let's carry that feeling with us as we turn the page. January 9th, 1944. Dear Emil, I was summoned today, not by fate or fortune, but by an officer with cold hands and a voice like unsharpened iron. He said my name like it was unfamiliar and told me the colonel needed to see me. No explanation, no gesture, just now. That morning, Adrian had not yet finished his bread. The crust had grown too hard overnight. It cracked as he bit it, and he remembers the sound, a small, brittle snap in a world already frayed at the edges. The sun had not yet risen. The world outside the barn was painted in tones of pewter and ash. Even the frost on the window panes seemed reluctant to melt. He had been writing, as always, pen in glove, his fingers cramping, but his mind clearer than usual. It is strange, Emil, how quickly your body learns to obey, even when your spirit hesitates. I stood, brushed the straw from my knees, and followed him out. The colonel's quarters were warmer than Adrian had expected. A stove hissed softly in the corner. Its glow threw flickering shadows across the tent's canvas walls, making the maps look as if they moved. There was coffee, real coffee, or something close enough to fool a desperate tongue. He didn't offer me any, but I smelled it. That was enough. My God, Emil, the smell, earthy, bitter, like mornings that weren't promised to end in gunfire. I hadn't smelled coffee in weeks. The colonel gestured to a chair. It creaked under Adrian's weight, not from age, but because his coat was heavy with ice and fatigue. He told me in the plainest voice that a decision had to be made. A village 2 kilometers east had not been evacuated. Resistance fighters, perhaps, or just frightened men with shotguns and children with old rifles. He didn't know. And it didn't matter, he said. The colonel's orders were clear. Send in a scouting unit, quietly. Find out what was left. Assess. And if any resistance was met, return fire immediately. He asked me to choose who would go. Someone you trust, he said, someone sharp. I didn't answer right away. I think he mistook my silence for loyalty. But it wasn't that. It was nausea, Emil. It rose in my throat like smoke. Adrian had 12 men under his care, none of them sharp. Not anymore, not in the ways the colonel meant. They were soft around the eyes, tired, some limped. One had begun speaking to shadows. Choosing one meant sending them into something unknowable. Perhaps a firefight? Perhaps a trap? Perhaps nothing at all? I thought of Anton first, then of his pebble. Then I thought of Muller, the big one with the cracked spectacles. He hadn't spoken since December. I don't think he could have navigated 2 kilometers, even in daylight. In the end, I said I would go myself. The colonel didn't flinch. He nodded, poured himself another cup of coffee, and waved Adrian away. That's how these decisions happened. Not in shouting or ceremony, but in canvas tents with hissing stoves and maps that danced on the walls. I told Anton and the others I needed air. They didn't ask questions. Perhaps they assumed I was just tired again. Perhaps they knew, but said nothing out of kindness. I took my rifle, my journal, and a half-broken compass. The snow had started again, not heavy, just enough to soften the path. My boots crunched softly, not loudly enough to matter. I walked in silence, no humming this time. The village, when he found it, was half sunk in snow. The roofs drooped under weight. Chimneys stood still, smokeless, no figures in the fields. No sound but the slow groaning of cold timber. I moved slowly, Emil, past a window with broken glass, past a barn door swinging crooked on its hinge. Everything here felt abandoned, or worse, paused, as if time had decided to wait for spring before returning. In one of the homes he found a scarf still hanging by the door. Knitted, small, a child's, he did not touch it. I think sometimes that absence is louder than presence. It's in the way your breath echoes in empty rooms, the way wind sounds when it has no one to bother, no resistance fighters, no guns, just empty beds, half-burned candles, and the faint scent of old potatoes and firewood long gone cold. Adrian returned just before dusk, his cheeks numb, his eyes damp, though not from snow. The colonel didn't ask what he saw. He simply crossed something off a list. Adrian never learned what. Emil, I did not tell the others. I simply sat by the wall, removed my boots, and began writing again. My hands were shaking. I think it was the coffee, or the thought of it, or the scarf, or perhaps it was just being human. Let's linger here with Adrian again, this time not as a boy lost in memory, but as a man placed in the uncomfortable seat of command. Leadership in war is not always accompanied by medals or salutes. Sometimes it's simply the act of choosing who walks into the unknown, who shoulders the next risk, who comes back and who might not. Adrian didn't volunteer to lead. His journal makes that clear. He wasn't the loudest nor the bravest. He was observant, thoughtful, perhaps too thoughtful for war. And yet, in that tent, with the stove humming and the maps trembling in heat and shadow, it was him they turned to. It's important to notice what Adrian didn't say in his letter. He didn't dramatize. He didn't rage or plead or cry on the page, but the silence between his words tells us everything. His nausea, his hesitation, the way he remembered coffee, not by taste, but by scent. That small detail, the smell of coffee, is telling. In a moment of moral pressure, his senses reached for something human, something civilized, something that reminded him of peace. It's what a man does when he is asked to play God in a world that has forgotten how to worship life. Choosing who would go, it's not just a question of names. It's a question of what you live with after. The kind of thoughts that echo when everything else goes quiet. And Adrian, our quiet diarist, decided that the only life he could risk was his own. We don't know if that was bravery or guilt. Perhaps both. Often they wear the same face. Even in the village, among the empty rooms and fading firewood, his concern was not tactical. It was personal. He noticed the scarf, not the rifles, the candles, not the fortifications. He returned not with intelligence, but with impressions. Soft, human impressions of absence. Adrian never told his men what he saw, not because it was unimportant, but perhaps because sharing it would make it more real, or more painful, or because, as a leader, he carried those images for them, so they wouldn't have to. In that moment, Adrian became something quiet and heavy. Not a soldier, not a hero, but a kind of emotional vessel, the one who bore the weight of choosing, and the silence of not saying why. We rarely think of leadership this way, but in war, especially on the cold margins of forgotten fronts, it often looks like this: a tired man holding a pen tighter than his rifle, choosing to protect others not with orders, but with silence. Let's carry that image as we turn the next page. January 21st, 1944. Dear Emil, I've walked this road many times now. Enough that the trees have names and the snowdrifts seem familiar. But today something changed. There was a house. The Dad hadn't been there before. It began during a routine morning patrol, the kind Adrian described as uneventful by design. 4 men, 1 path, cold boots, wind that whispered low and steady like breath against a window pane. The path curled through birch trees, their pale bark stripped in places by age or wind. Adrian, walking second, noted a familiar frostbitten log beside the trail, the same one they passed 3 days prior. The air carried the brittle scent of pine needles and cordite. But just beyond the tree line, in a shallow hollow between snow-covered ridges, stood a house. Not a ruin, not a shack. A house, intact, upright, and utterly ordinary. That was what made it strange. It had no tracks leading to it, no chimney smoke, no path through the snow. It simply was. His patrol stopped. Anton, now quietly relied upon, tilted his head and muttered, "Was that here yesterday?" No one answered, not because they knew, but because the question felt fragile. The house was small, single-storied, with wooden walls painted a pale gray that seemed to mimic the color of the sky. The windows were shut, curtains drawn. The roof sagged ever so slightly at the corners, but the structure was clearly inhabited, or had been recently. The door was closed, but not locked. I remember how the handle felt in my palm, cold, smooth, almost recent. No rust, no resistance, as if it had just been used. Inside, the air was stale but not unpleasant. The scent of dried herbs lingered. Lavender, maybe, or chamomile. There were shoes by the door. 2 pairs, 1 adult, 1 child. Perfectly aligned. In the corner, a cradle, empty but freshly dusted. A kettle sat on the stove. No fire, but a few flecks of soot suggested it had been used. Perhaps last week or last night. We didn't speak much, Emil. The silence inside that house was different. Not threatening, just hollow in a very human way, like someone had stepped out and forgotten to come back. On the table, they found a notebook, written in a language Adrian didn't recognize. Not quite Russian, not quite German. The script curved strangely, like wind-blown branches. I traced the writing with my finger. It felt oddly familiar, like something I'd dreamt but couldn't recall clearly. The others didn't want to take it. "Leave it," Anton whispered. And we did. Before leaving, Adrian stepped into what must have been a bedroom. The bed was made. The sheets had folds, as if someone had just risen. A small mirror rested on a wooden desk, and beside it a lock of hair tied with a red ribbon. It felt somehow more private than any battlefield I've walked through, as if I was trespassing on something sacred. I backed away without looking into the mirror. They left the house quietly. They said nothing on the way back. No one marked it on the map. No report was written. That evening I returned alone, just to see, to understand. But there was nothing there. Only snow. A hollow. Trees. No walls. No cradle. No shoes. Not even the footprint I'd left. I don't know what it was, Emil. A dream within a waking world. A memory buried in a place I've never known. But I wrote it here because it's real to me. That house existed, even if only for a moment. Sometimes I think war opens cracks, and through them, we glimpse other lives. Lives paused, lives forgotten, lives we weren't meant to see, but stumbled into nonetheless. There's no need to solve this. Adrian didn't, and neither should we. The house he saw wasn't part of a mission, a legend, or a soldier's tale passed around the fire. It wasn't haunting or hostile. It simply wasn't supposed to be there, and that made it unforgettable. Sometimes war flattens the extraordinary, but occasionally it sharpens the senses just enough that something strange slips through. Whether it was a hallucination, a leftover village memory, or something more spiritual, Adrian approached it with quiet reverence. Notice how he recorded every detail, not with urgency, but with care. The weight of the door handle, the ribbon in the mirror, the script he could not read. His was not the curiosity of a soldier. It was the curiosity of a man whose soul had been frayed by death, and who suddenly brushed against something living, or at least preserved. These moments remind us that history is not only made in headlines and strategy, but in the inexplicable flickers, the strange intersections between memory, trauma, and wonder. Adrian's discovery will never make it into a war report, but here, in his journal, it breathes, and perhaps that is enough. January 27th, 1944. They've moved us to a base behind the line. It's quiet here, too quiet, maybe. No shells in the distance. No radio static, just the wind, the snow, and the sound of shovels. The colonel's quarters are near. I've seen it like something from before the war. As the division retreated from the front for winter rotation, the brutal clarity of combat faded into something softer, but no less disorienting. For Adrian, the transition wasn't welcome. It was strange, disconnected, like walking into someone else's dream. Imagine it. After weeks spent in frozen fields and collapsing trenches, your squad has marched through the fir-covered hills to a converted estate, a place where time had seemingly stopped. Snow falls gently onto carved stone balustrades. Wooden doors open without creaking. There's no shouting, no orders barked through teeth clenched against the cold. Here, the war tiptoes. The manor stood like a ghost from another era, its shutters closed, its windows glowing with orange light. I could smell cooked onions. That broke me more than any shell did, email. It reminded me of Mother's kitchen in spring. The officers' dining hall was something of a legend among the rank and file. Most never saw it, only whispered about it during smoke breaks, how there was real bread, how the butter didn't come from a tin, how they played music during supper. But Adrian did see it. Briefly, he was called to deliver a supply log and administrative errand wrapped in protocol. And so, for a moment, he stepped inside the war's most curated silence. The hallway had mirrors. I caught sight of myself, mud-caked, thin, eyes like stone. And then I looked past myself into a room filled with warmth. The contrast was dizzying. Inside, polished cutlery, a cloth table, a bowl of fruit not fresh, surely, but placed as if it were. Candles flickered against the glass. There was music playing, not loud, not lively, just music. A violin, I think, something French. It was the kind of sound you don't hear anymore when you've slept beside machine guns. The men around the table, majors, colonels, staff lieutenants, were not unaware of the war. They bore lines beneath their eyes. They spoke low, occasionally glancing at maps. But their shoulders weren't hunched from cold. Their breath didn't fog in front of their mouths. Their boots were clean. One of them asked me if I wanted tea. I paused, almost said yes, but something in me refused. Like saying yes meant something was wrong, like I didn't belong in the warmth. Officers' privileges during wartime weren't just about comfort. They were about continuity. In the chaos of mud and loss, someone had to stay dry enough to write orders. Someone had to eat 3 meals to think clearly, to strategize, to plan the next movement. And yet, Adrian saw what others might miss, the hidden burden of those who were kept apart. Their distance wasn't always cruelty, it was insulation, a structure maintained by military necessity, but felt deeply by those outside it. There's no comfort without contrast, he wrote. Perhaps they dine in warmth, so we don't forget what peace used to taste like. Still, the separation gnawed at him. He wasn't angry. He was curious. What did it mean to be at war, but untouched by its textures? Could command exist without mud beneath your nails? Without the ache in your back from frozen ground? That night, Adrian returned to his quarters, a drafty barracks with low wooden beams and damp corners. The others were asleep, huddled close. He took out his journal and wrote by candlelight. I dreamed of soup. Not the kind from a ration tin, real soup, with herbs and steam and something like garlic. I dreamed I ate it in silence, while someone played the piano. No one spoke, no one shouted, and for once I wasn't afraid to fall asleep. Let's take a moment to reflect. What does it mean? To watch warmth from the cold? You are Adrian Kruger. You've led men through frozen forests and into collapsing trenches. You've watched frost form on their faces. You've counted the rations to the last biscuit. And then suddenly you're standing at the threshold of a colonel's dining hall with the scent of cooked onions drifting past silver candlesticks and white cloth. You see something your body remembers, but your reality no longer allows. Normalcy. But it isn't real, not for you. Not anymore. That kind of warmth, the polished comfort of command, isn't something you step into. It's something you observe, like a photo of yourself from before the war. when you still laughed without watching your breath fog in the air. And this is where the tension lies, not just in the mud versus the mansion, but in what it does to a man's sense of place. The line isn't between soldier and officer, poor and privileged. It's subtler. It's in how war splits the world into those who endure and those who direct. And what happens when someone like Adrian lives with a foot in both? It is a peculiar loneliness, being close enough to comfort, to smell it, but never quite able to taste it. The soldier's hunger becomes more than physical. It becomes spiritual, a longing not just for food or heat, but for the memory of what life was like before he learned how to survive on nothing. And here is something else to consider. The officers weren't villains in Adrian's eyes. He doesn't rage in his diary. He doesn't mock their music or their table. He just notices it, with the quiet ache of someone who understands why the warmth must exist, but still feels the sting of being outside it. There's no comfort without contrast, he once wrote. Perhaps they dine in warmth so we don't forget what peace used to taste like. He wasn't bitter. He was tired. Tired in a way only someone who has survived too much silence can be. And still, he kept writing, not out of hope, but to make sense of the gap between where he stood and what he saw. And so we ask you, gently, what would it do to you to sleep each night 5 feet from comfort and never step inside? What kind of man would you become? Would you envy the fire or simply remember what it felt like and carry on? From the pack of Private Gerhard Weiss, winter 1944, February 3rd, 1944, we found him half buried beneath the snow, beside the edge of the ravine. No sound, no sign of struggle, just peace in the cruelest form it can arrive. His pack was still intact. In it, 4 letters. None had stamps, none had dates. None were ever sent. There is a strange intimacy in reading another man's letter, especially when that man can no longer speak. Adrian never pried for curiosity. He opened Gerhard's letters because there was no one left who could, and perhaps because the words asked to be read. The paper was soft from moisture, the ink beginning to blur into the grain. But the handwriting was deliberate, slanted, measured. The first letter was addressed simply to Lena. My dearest Lena, do you remember the bakery near the train station? The one with the poppy seed rolls that you said smelled like your grandmother's kitchen? We'd passed it the day I left. The air smelled the same. Warm bread and morning smoke. I almost turned around. It's cold here. Not sharp, not loud. Just always cold. Even when the sun rises, the frost doesn't flinch. The snow doesn't melt. You would laugh at how clumsy I am in the boots. I trip like a child, but I keep going. I have to. When I come home, I want to see you in that yellow dress again, the one you wore last spring when we danced by the river. Remember that? We had no music, just your humming. Tell Mother I miss her stew, even the burnt kind. Yours until the last snow melts. Gerhard Adrian folded the letter carefully, his fingers trembling more from memory than cold. He wrote in his own journal that night, "What hurts most is not the letter, it's the life between the lines. The kind of life we forget we're fighting to return to." Gerhard didn't write about courage. He wrote about poppy seed rolls and burnt stew. That's what survival really means, the luxury of the mundane. Imagine now you are Adrian again, sitting in the low candlelight of a rickety bunkhouse. Outside, the wind combs through pine branches. Inside, your boots are drying by the hearth. You unfold another letter, this one unfinished. To Father, I know you never liked that I left the tool shed behind, that you thought I should have stayed to take over the shop, but I wanted to see what the world looked like beyond our village. I know now that the world is colder than I expected. Not cruel, just colder. That was all. There's a particular sadness in an unfinished sentence. It hums louder than silence. Adrian stared at those last words, his eyes burning from the firelight, or perhaps something older. He didn't get to finish saying it, he later wrote. Most of us won't. Most of us have a sentence still hanging somewhere behind our eyes. In the weeks that followed, Adrian made a quiet habit of collecting letters. He didn't read them all. He couldn't, but he kept them, marked them by name if a name was written, filed them into a tin box beneath his bunk. He called it the archive that breathes. I'm not God, Emil, he wrote, but maybe, just maybe, if someone remembers their words, they haven't fully gone. There's something profoundly human about a letter. It is, at its core, a reaching out from one person to another, across distance, time, or even death. A letter says, I was here. I thought of you. I mattered to someone. And in war, that quiet reaching is louder than any gunfire. Adrian understood that. That's why he wrote every day, even when the ink froze in the pen, even when his hands trembled. Because one day he believed someone would read his letter too, not to mourn him, but simply to know that once in the frozen quiet of February 1944, he was still dreaming of warm bread, yellow dresses, and dances by the river. We buried him with no name, but not without memory. February 19th, 1944, near the abandoned orchard south of Hill 43. Snowfall, light, wind, steady, silence, total. They found him near a stream, face tilted to the frost-heavy sky. No tags, no papers, no coat. The only thing in his possession was a faded photo creased in 4, worn thin from handling. It showed a woman holding a small child. Neither smiled. Both stared into the lens as though they knew time would carry this image further than their voices ever could. Adrian knelt beside the body and whispered, You were someone. It had become a quiet tradition, unspoken, untrained. When a soldier had no name, Adrian gave them something else. A moment, a ritual, a pause in the storm. Imagine the scene now. A small clearing beside the trees. Frost clings to every branch like lace. The remaining squad stands with heads bowed, not because they knew the man, but because he once left somewhere. He once drank from a canteen, rolled dice, muttered in his sleep. He belonged to someone. Adrian pulls the photograph from the man's pocket and places it in a shallow tin box sealed, carefully. He scribbles a number onto a scrap of ration paper and buries it beside the man. Then he speaks. We commit this man to the earth. We do not know his name, but we know he walked with us. He was one of us. And he mattered. He never raised his voice, never made it a show. It was always short, always simple, but always said. Later, back at camp, Adrian opens his journal and writes the words, Entry 73, unknown, male, age estimate, early 20s, found near stream, wore no tags, buried with care, beneath the 3 crooked pine trees at the southern edge. Small photo found. Preserved. Box 7. Marker etched into bark. May someone someday speak his name. Even if it's the wrong one, there's something deeply human in naming. It gives shape to identity. It anchors us to memory. And yet, war has a cruel way of unraveling names. It burns them off tags, blurs them from photos, leaves soldiers buried under numbers, coordinates, and uns. But Adrian fought against that. In the midst of chaos, he became a scribe of the forgotten. He kept records, descriptions, fragments, hints. He refused to let these men become faceless. If memory is all we can give them, then let it be enough, he wrote. He once spent 2 nights in the snow trying to trace the origins of a pendant found on a dead soldier. Just a small silver cross, engraved with a date. He never found the answer, but he logged it, boxed it, marked the burial site with 3 stones instead of 1, so that when I'm gone, he said, someone else might come, someone might wonder, someone might care. Imagine now you are standing beside Adrian at that grave. You look down and you realize there is no name, no rank, no birth date, but still something remains. A photo, a pendant, a ritual. That is the paradox of remembrance. Even in anonymity there can be dignity, and even without names there can be love. This is what war often forgets, but Adrian remembered. Not the statistics, not the victories, but the faces, the fragments. The silence after a life leaves the world, and the care taken to mark that silence with honor. When the world froze, I made little fires inside my mind. March 2nd, 1944, Eastern Front, near the burned railway depot. Snow, packed thick along the ridges, clouds unmoving. Silence, padded by memory. There was snow in March, not the playful kind, not the sort children race through or lovers carve names into. This was war snow ash-colored, unmoving, unmelting. It clung to boots like guilt and pressed against tents like unwanted memories. For Adrian, this snow became a symbol, a metaphor, a quiet, cold canvas against which he painted his survival. Because even the strongest soldier needs something, a rhythm, a ritual, a way to hold on to themselves when everything else dissolves. The journal was his anchor. No matter what happened during the day, bombardments, burials, frostbite, he returned to the same ritual each night. A square of canvas, a stub of pencil, and the same question: what did the world look like today? This habit, he wrote once, is not about remembering. It's about refusing to forget myself. He logged temperatures, bird sightings, conversations often imagined. He recorded the exact weight of silence after a friend's passing. He once described the taste of a snowflake as cold like silence, soft like surrender. By giving names to things, sounds, moments, feelings, Adrian kept the war from swallowing him whole. At night, when he couldn't sleep, Adrian would reconstruct familiar places in his mind. A bakery in Dresden, a curved handle of his grandfather's teacup, the scent of river moss near his childhood fishing spot. He became, in these quiet hours, a cartographer of memory, redrawing safe places with careful precision. Sometimes he invited others into these imagined landscapes. A fellow soldier, homesick beyond words, would describe his family's vineyard, and Adrian would nod, eyes closed, adding it to the map in his mind. "I've been to more countries in my thoughts," he once said, "than my boots ever reached." There were things Adrian never wrote down. not because he didn't remember, but because telling them would make them too real. Instead, he reshaped them into small stories, fictionalized, softened, turned slightly sideways, so the pain could be looked at indirectly. He told younger recruits tales of a mythical soldier who never missed a shot but always forgot where he placed his helmet. He invented a mule that could smell mines and a trench ghost who played harmonica during thunderstorms. Laughter, even dry and quiet, was a release valve. Fiction became a safety net. "If I can laugh at the darkness," he once whispered into the cold, "then it hasn't won." Adrian never called these rituals coping mechanisms. He never labeled them as psychological tools. To him, they were just things he did. But within those quiet habits, the daily writing, the mental maps, the half-true stories, we see the architecture of endurance, the small scaffolds that kept his identity from crumbling under uniformity and trauma. These were not escapes, they were anchors, gentle tethers to a self that refused to vanish. Even his silence was intentional. When comrades asked why he never cried, Adrian simply said, "Because if I start, I don't know when I'll stop. But if I write, I can pause between sentences." And so, as the snow stayed frozen, Adrian thawed himself from within, through pages, through imagined walks home, through memories reshaped into myths. Perhaps that is all any of us can do in the darkest hours, light small fires in our minds. Not to burn away the cold, but to remember what warmth feels like. And somewhere, between fiction and fact, between silence and song, Adrian survived. Not untouched, not whole, but still Adrian. Not all prayers are whispered. Some are folded, cleaned, buried, and remembered. March 7th, 1944, near the abandoned chapel in woods between Sokol and Brody Wind, restless and circular. Snow, thinning, gray at the edges. The war quieter for now. Entry found tucked beside a rusted crucifix, pages pressed with ash and sap. It wasn't religion that kept Adrian steady. Not in the trenches. Not on the march, not even in the thickest grief. What grounded him, what gave meaning to the loss, the dirt, the endless repetition, were the rituals. Small acts, precise movements. A way to carve sense into senselessness. Each time a comrade fell, Adrian folded their uniform with exacting care. He would sit cross-legged beside the body, as if preparing for a ceremony. The buttons would be brushed, the sleeves aligned. He'd smooth the collar with the back of his knuckles. If there were personal effects, photos, letters, a rosary, they would be wrapped carefully inside, tucked near the heart. It was not about tidiness, he once noted. It was about giving the fallen one final moment of dignity. To be seen, to be remembered, to be touched with something that wasn't fire or steel. The ritual didn't change the outcome, but it slowed time, made space for breath between endings. Where graves were impossible, Adrian found trees. With a small pocket knife dulled by repetition, he carved quiet initials into bark. Just initials, no dates, no words. Sometimes he added a second mark, a line, a cross, a small circle, depending on the fallen man's personality. 1 tick mark for a joker, 2 for a letter writer. A full ring for those who had no known family. Over time, the forest behind the lines became a private cemetery, a coded memoir in wood. Trees remember, Adrian once told another soldier, and they don't forget when we're gone. Adrian kept a tin box filled with spare buttons from uniforms. Each one he removed by hand, never cut. The box clicked softly, as it filled, a mosaic of brass and bone, each button carrying a name, a night, a memory. He would sometimes polish them in the dark, one by one, not to make them shine, but to keep his hands busy, his thoughts slow. "I've held more buttons than bullets," he mused. "Maybe that's why I still know who I am." He intended to return the box to someone's mother one day. He never decided which mother. He just wanted it to be held again by someone who had known softness. Before sleep, if sleep ever came, Adrian would perform a count in his mind, not of victories, not of rations, but of names. Eric, who hummed when he carved wood. Felix, who cried when writing his last letter. Matthias, who always offered his portion of bread. It was never the same list, and sometimes he forgot names that haunted him. "I count not to tally," he wrote, "but to hold them. Each time I name them, they return, not as ghosts, but as men. There is something profound in routine, even in war, especially in war." The world around Adrian crumbled buildings, ideologies, maps, but in these small, repetitive rituals, he built a sanctuary, not of stone or belief, but of pattern, of intention. These acts didn't stop the dying, but they made the living bearable. They were prayers for the unreligious, eulogies written without words, a final courtesy in a place that had forgotten how to be kind. Perhaps we misunderstand sacredness. We think of cathedrals, holy books, sermons. But what if the sacred is also a button passed between fingers, a name whispered to the wind, a collar straightened after death? Adrian's rituals were not grand. They were not public. They were not celebrated, but they mattered. To him, to those he buried, and perhaps now to us. And in the hush between two shellings, in the forest of carved trees, in the cold hum of memory, these rituals became something eternal, something still warm in the snow. The last written entry from Adrian's journal ends abruptly, not in the middle of a sentence, not smeared in haste, but quietly. The ink is even, the pressure steady. No final declaration, no crescendo of emotion, just a dated line at the bottom of a page. April 2nd, 1944. Southern Poland. Frost returning. Felix was singing again this morning. "We may have eggs tomorrow." That would be something. And that's all. No mention of his condition. No talk of impending danger. No sense that the next dawn might not come for him. He didn't know it would be the last, but maybe he suspected. Maybe he chose not to name it. The official records list Adrian as missing, presumed killed, during a quiet but treacherous patrol through a mined wood, days after his last journal entry. There was no gunfire that night, no grand battle, just fog and silence, and the soft crunch of boots over frost-hardened soil. They never found his body, but near where he was last seen, soldiers later discovered a carved tree initials, 2 tick marks, and a single button nailed into the bark. Not his own name, not his own button. He left a memory for someone else, even in his final moments. We often imagine that people sense their ending, feel the shadow approaching. But Adrian's writings remained steady, clear-eyed, unburdened by the theatrical. Yet subtle things shifted in those final entries. He no longer described the cold as brutal, but expected. He no longer said, "If we get home," but "if they remember us." He wrote more about his comrades than himself. He praised the way Marcus told stories, the way Joseph hummed while fixing boots, The way Stefan scratched a dog behind the ear, even though the dog wasn't really there. And maybe that's the truest sign. Adrian had already begun to let go of himself, to dissolve into others, into ritual, into remembrance. No grave, no confirmed place of death, no medals posthumously awarded. But the forest he carved into still stands. Some of the initials have been swallowed by bark, others lost to rot or weather, but a few remain quiet scars in living wood. The box of buttons was found decades later, rusted shut. It now rests in a small war museum in Krakow. There's no plaque with Adrian's name, just a sign that reads, "Found near unmarked graves. Contents, 31 buttons." A young curator once said, "I don't know who he was, but I think he remembered everyone else. That feels important." Adrian didn't die with a bang. He disappeared gently, slipped from the pages of his own journal. But perhaps that's how many of the fallen pass, not in flame or fury, but in the quiet gesture, the unsent letter, the shared crust of bread. And now you know his name. You've walked beside him, felt the frost, heard the whistles, held the rituals. He lives again, not in glory, but in presence, in memory, and perhaps that's all he ever wanted. The war for us is over. The page is turned, the journal closed, softly. You rest now in your own bed, far from trenches, far from patrols, far from whispers in the snow. And somewhere, beneath the cover of night, beneath the hush of trees, a soldier sits hands folded, face quiet still, counting names before sleep, his own name still missing from the list. Because even now, he is still remembering you.